If you love to read, then you probably already know that you should be reading broadly across genres, fiction and non-fiction. But we're all guilty of reading blind spots. At times in my own reading journey, I've only read non-fiction, and at other times I've only read fiction. We also move through periods of differing levels of reading quality. Sometimes I've read real just pulp, and other times I've read far too much work that was just difficult. It's really important that we make sure that we're reading a broad set of work that is high quality, and that's what I want to talk about today. I find that people generally fall into two major groups, those that read mostly fiction and those that read mostly non-fiction, and that's a really dangerous way to begin your reading. There is a great deal that fiction can teach you that non-fiction can't, and likewise there's a huge amount that non-fiction can teach you that fiction is unable to talk about. So today I'm going to cover how and why you should read broadly. I'm going to talk about why you should read fiction if you're mainly a non-fiction reader, and also talk about the reverse, why you should read non-fiction if you're mainly a fiction reader. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to select high quality fiction and what types of fiction to avoid. And I'm also going to talk about non-fiction and the sort of non-fiction books that you should avoid. And then finally I'm going to share with you a bunch of book lists that I turn to when I don't know what to read that help me choose really high quality reading that you can also use. Now, I'm obviously advocating that you should read both fiction and non-fiction, but it's important to note as well that within fiction and non-fiction there are many different genres and styles, and we should read as many of those as possible. Obviously we all have our preference for the style that we prefer, and it's important to keep reading, so don't stick with things that you hate. You know, I'm not a huge fan of poetry, but I try to read some poetry every year. You're going to find that when you start to read more broadly that your reading becomes more difficult than maybe you're used to. When you read genres that you're not familiar with, or say you switch from fiction to non-fiction or vice versa, it will take a while, maybe longer than you think, to adapt to the way that those books are written. I remember when I used to read a lot of non-fiction, I really struggled to read fiction. I just couldn't see the point. That's because pulling out the lessons from fiction and what's important about them takes a different style of work to pulling out non-fiction. It just takes a little bit of time to learn to do that. I also think a surefire way to fail at reading more broadly is to just read one book at a time. And this is kind of a novel idea to a lot of people, but if you read a book that is of an unfamiliar genre or is opposite to what you usually read, it's a difficult thing to read. You're going to struggle. That means that you're less likely to want to pick it up. Reading multiple books means that you've got something else to turn to maintain your reading habit over time. It also means you're much more likely to finish that more difficult book because you can take a break from it and come back to it when you feel more motivated. I often find that if you just try and force your way through a difficult book, your reading just stalls out and you end up reading nothing for weeks. I often implement a 4-book reading strategy. So I'll choose 4 books in these 4 criteria. One, I'll be reading a classic, and classics tend to be the most difficult thing that I read, though my ability is growing in them. To complement that classic, which is usually a work of fiction, I will read a high quality but more modern fiction. These tend to be easier reads that I can pick up more often and definitely don't need a pen and paper to be able to understand. So I'll read then 2 non-fiction books to complete the set of 4. One of those will be a difficult work, so generally a work of philosophy or something similar, though that's just because that aligns with my interest. And here the key thing is that I'll read a work that I find less difficult. And I find having this blend of 2 difficult books, 2 easier books, 2 fiction, 2 non-fiction, a really effective way that I've always got something that I want to read. So why read fiction if you only read non-fiction? And the most common thing that I hear from non-fiction only readers is that fiction isn't real. And I think this is a relatively naive approach to fiction. Fiction is real in the sense that these characters and the things that happen, though they don't literally exist, they are recognisable and they do exist in some sort of hyper-real state. When you read literature, you will identify people that you know that are just like the characters that you read. The other advantage of fiction is that there are certain ideas that can be explored more fully in fiction than can be explored in non-fiction. Fiction gives an author that freedom to construct a world that perfectly encapsulates their argument or point, and that can be a very powerful literary device that's not available to the non-fiction reader. You'll find that often the lessons that are in fiction, once identified, stick very powerfully in the mind because fiction is so viscerally visual and produces these really powerful images, sometimes much more powerful than can be produced in non-fiction. That lesson embeds itself in the mind because that visual you recall so easily. I also find that fiction is able to speak to an ethical and moral development of our character that non-fiction struggles to reach. There are topics such as ethics and our morals that are not technical in nature and not easily explained in the sort of systematic writing of a non-fiction book. There is certain types of wisdom that can only be shared through stories and through retelling them. If you don't read fiction, then you miss this huge chunk of knowledge that is part of the human condition. So if you only read fiction, here are some reasons why you might approach non-fiction. And one of them being that there are some absolutely incredible true stories out there that happen to real people. Some of the actual things that have happened in history are just as exciting and amazing and as surprising as some of the best fiction. And that's remarkable when you think about it. People have done some incredible things and have bared some incredible burdens in their life stories, and reading about those is really, really rewarding for your own development. There are some non-fiction works out there that are of such incredible intellectual construction that it's truly amazing what human beings are capable of. You know, there are books that I haven't finished yet, like Gödel Escher Back by Douglas Hofstadter, which just every time I open it, I'm just blown away by the capacity of the human mind to be so much more intellectual and smarter and broader thinking than I am. Of course, all of those things hold true for fiction, and I think my point here is that you will find that between fiction and non-fiction there is much greater overlap when it comes to the human intellect than you might first imagine. And maybe it's obvious to say, but there are ideas that are technical in nature and can't be explained through fiction. If you want to learn about history, then you've got no choice but to read non-fiction. Though historical fiction can be a powerful way to introduce you to history, it's at the end of the day a fiction, and there is obviously value in reading the real thing. I've often thought that good fiction teaches you who you are, and good non-fiction places you in the wider context of the human story. There are hundreds and thousands of books, and most of them aren't very good. So choosing high quality reading can be intimidating. So I wanted to talk about some of the ways that I select fiction and non-fiction. But obviously these are just my personal biases and also rules of thumb, and there are many exceptions to the rule. It's not possible to condense down a very personal and also complex topic into a sequence of witty and true aphorisms. You're also likely to choose a book that is not very good sometimes, or just doesn't suit you, in which case you should, and I will always say this, feel free to abandon those books. So when it comes to selecting fiction, I think that a little bit of research goes a long way, especially when it comes to genre reading. Finding out who the most well-regarded authors in that genre are is a different thing from the bestsellers. Now, many well-regarded authors have written bestsellers. It's not always the case that a best-selling work of genre reading is the best thing to be reading. You know, I think Brandon Sanderson is an excellent example of this. And I've read a lot of Sanderson. Sanderson is like McDonald's. Okay, I like McDonald's. I eat McDonald's. Every time I eat it, I want to eat more, but it's doing nothing for my health. And similarly, while Sanderson is a competent and exciting at times writer, there's nothing complex or intellectual about it. And if you're looking to develop as a reader and an intellect, you know, Sanderson is really just entertainment rather than high quality reading. And if you need any more evidence that a bestseller is no indication of quality, then you need only look at 50 Shades of Grey, which, if you've ever taken the time to read, as I did in college, is truly a terrible piece of writing. Another criteria that I often look at is how many books this author has written in comparison to their age. Now, just because somebody's a prolific writer doesn't mean they're a bad writer. Some of the best writers in history have been extremely prolific. You find generally in crime and mystery and thriller authors who produce huge amounts of work. While I'm not saying that this work is necessarily bad, it tends to be reading purely for entertainment. Authors that have fiction that tells you something or teaches you something or has an important lesson or complex idea simply cannot be produced in such volume. If you are looking at a prolific author, have a little look at their age, and that might tell you something about how high quality the ideas are in that book. And another thing to look at as a criteria, though it's not always perfect, is how long has that book been in print? You know, if a book has been in print for hundreds of years, then it's probably a good indicator that it's of a high quality. Now, reading books that are old is very difficult if you haven't done it, which is why I advocate for a multiple book reading technique. If you've never read any of the classics, then you're going to struggle, and your skill does improve with time, but getting through that first one is definitely the hardest. In general, I think that, you know, pretty much any fiction book that you can pick up, even if it's not of the best quality or doesn't have the sort of most profound ideas wasn't a total waste of time. However, when it comes to non-fiction, there are books out there that are a total waste of time. Non-fiction, because of its nature, the burden of truth is much higher than fiction. If a non-fiction book is untrue, then it just isn't worth your time. There is also a greater percentage of non-fiction books that I think are bad, and it's much harder to find non-fiction books that are of a good quality. One easy but maybe controversial selection criteria that you can use is if you're in an airport and you see a book in an airport bookstore, then it's not worth your time. And similarly, this falls into a wider category of non-fiction books that are about 250 pages, which is generally just a blog post that's got a growth hormone. Somebody had a good idea once and they've managed to get a book deal out of it, and the reason why these books exist is because they sell very well. However, you can generally find that blog post online, or you can go on YouTube and hear that author talk about that thing. You can get all the value that that book's got without having to read 250 pages of extrapolation. Another, I think, surefire way of finding a low quality non-fiction book is to find out what the author is trying to sell you. The best non-fiction I've ever read, the author has got nothing to sell you. They are a writer and they write non-fiction because it is their passion and their life's purpose. A lot of non-fiction is written to sell you an idea or a system or a product, and this is generally of a lower quality. Most pop science really should be classified as fiction. These books are generally written to win research grants for their work, and generally the results are overstated or important details are missed to convince you that this is something that you should be engaged in. That's not to say that all pop science is bad. It just means that you need to really carefully research what you're reading before you engage in something. For example, something like Bad Science by Ben Goldacre is a brilliant book about how statistics are used to lie to you, and that's well worth your time. But many pop science books are no good. Even some real classics of the genre, such as Thinking, Fast and Slow, that book now, most of those studies aren't relevant anymore, and while it's an interesting read, people have bought into a system of thinking that just isn't true. I've talked a lot about what you shouldn't be reading, but I should now tell you, I guess, what you should be reading. And a really useful way of identifying high quality books, lists of books that have won the major literary awards. These lists aren't perfect. Every list of books is flawed in some way. There are biases, either by location or by race or country, and that's all worth keeping in mind. Every award book list receives criticism that it's merely a popularity contest. That's also useful to keep in mind. Sometimes the runner-ups are better than the winners. But all these criticisms aside, I do think these are useful starting places for identifying really high quality books, and if at least not the books, then maybe some of the authors that you should be looking at. And I actually put together a list of recommended work from the Nobel Prize for Literature authors, which you can find on my Substack, and I've included a link in the description below for that. But my own opinions aside, there are some book lists that I turn to often, and one of those is the Pulitzer Prize for non-fiction. Now, being a Pulitzer Prize, obviously there is an American bias and also a journalistic bias to the types of books that are selected. They mostly tend to be historical or biographical in nature, but I've never regretted reading one of these books. They tend to be very long, but they tend to be of extremely high quality and very well researched. So that's a great launching off point if you're interested in that kind of thing. The Modern Library have an excellent 100 book list for both fiction and non-fiction. They tend to focus on works that are older, so these works tend to be a little bit more difficult to read, though I've read quite a lot of these lists and I've always found the recommendation to be very good. These works have always challenged me and they've always developed me both as a reader and a person. And it's a great place to go look for fiction or non-fiction that has been well regarded. And obviously, if you're familiar with this channel, I'm a big advocate for the classics, both the Harvard Classics collection or the great books of the Western world. One of the advantages of these sets is that, one, you can find what's included online, but pretty much everything in these sets is available for free online because of their aid, which means that you can go and read this stuff immediately. Though, the downside of it is that these are by far the most difficult works that you can read. The language is archaic, the style is very unfamiliar, and it will take real study to use these books effectively. Now, not a award list, but I want to highlight a particular author's recommendations, which is Ryan Holiday. His book recommendations are excellent. Most of these books you won't have heard of, or if you have heard of them, you've heard of them because they're on Holiday's recommendation list. and I'll include links to all of these lists in the description, but found many surprising and very worthwhile titles in these lists, so I wanted to highlight that as a place to go, mainly for non-fiction. And for fiction, for genre, so sci-fi and fantasy, there is obviously the well-known and well-regarded Hugo and Nebula awards. Now, in recent history, Hugo have had some problems with vote manipulation and stuff, and I've generally found Hugo to lean slightly more towards the popular rather than the excellent. That is to say that Nebula, which is an American sci-fi award which uses a panel rather than a popular vote, there is quite a bit of overlap, so it's not like Hugo's gone wrong every time. They're both excellent starting points for reading high quality sci-fi and fantasy, and some of the most important ideas and some of the best ideas I've ever encountered have been in speculative fiction. And then in general, I think the Booker Prize is a great place to start when looking at literature. Now obviously the Booker Prize is English speaking and has a British slant to it, and I don't think the Booker Prize has got it right every time. However, there is a great set of work, not only in the winners, but also the runner-ups, and I do often read Booker Prize fiction, and it's always good, at least, and often very good.